So today I wanted to just give a talk about the origins of echocardiography and how the entire field started and developed. I thought it would be kind of an interesting discussion and see kind of what people's thoughts are, and if they have any knowledge of this area already. Be happy to hear some thoughts at the end of the presentation. The objectives for the talk today are to go over and understand the historical development of echocardiography and talk about some of the key milestones from when it first started to now its modern day applications. I wanted to talk about some of the pioneers and major innovations that have happened in this field, and also analyze the impact of echocardiography on modern medicine now, including how it's revolutionized the diagnosis and management of various cardiovascular diseases and improving patient care in the process. So just a quick disclosure, because of the retrospective nature of this talk and the content that it entails, there have been clearly countless individuals across the globe who've contributed to the field of echocardiography. And so in the presentation today, I'm just going to talk about some of the major milestones. So there's definitely people and organizations who've contributed great work to this that aren't going to be discussed today, unfortunately. So here's kind of the overview or timeline that we'll discuss today, starting from the 1880s all the way down to the 70s, and then the advancements that have occurred in echocardiography since then. So I want to start first by talking about the piezoelectric effect. So this was something that was discovered in 1880 in France by two brothers, Pierre and Jacques Curie, who were working at lab assistants at the Faculty of Sciences of Paris. They essentially discovered that when they applied mechanical pressure to different crystals like quartz, tourmaline, and Rochelle salts, it generated electrical charges on the surface of those materials, which they could then convert into electrical energy. So that conversion of mechanical into electrical energy is what kind of spark plugged this whole process, and that's called the direct piezoelectric effect. And piezo is derived from the Greek word, which means to press. Then we move on forward in terms of how the piezoelectric effect was actually applied in science. So the first known practical application of the piezoelectric effect was in the 1910s during World War I by a doctorate student named Paul Langevin, also in France. So he built this ultrasonic submarine detector that consisted of a transducer that was made of thin quartz. So that was the crystal that they used, glued between two steel plates and a hydrophone. So essentially the transducer with the crystal emitted a high frequency pulse into the water, and then the hydrophone was used to detect the returning echo. And by measuring the amount of time it took for them to hear the echo, it was possible for them to calculate the depth of a submarine. And so this was essentially technology that was started during World War I. It wasn't finished until after the war ended. And on the right, we see a prototype design that Paul Langevin had made at that time. Next, we'll move on to the 1940s. So now we're going to talk about a gentleman named Floyd Firestone at the University of Michigan in the USA. And he constructed something called the ultrasonic reflectoscope. So this was kind of the first machine that had ultrasonic properties that was used in a practical setting in kind of widespread industry. And the reason why he made this initially was to measure different metals and solids, and it was used for non-destructive testing of those metals. So they would use the reflectoscope to send sound waves into different solid metal parts and other various substances like wood, and they would observe the reflections from the different boundaries of the part or from the various flaws within it. And so that was one of the first ways that they were actually able to test the quality of different surfaces and metals without breaking them down. So it was called non-destructive testing, and that was the first use of this ultrasonic reflectoscope. So he applied for a patent for this invention during World War II and ultimately published his method in 1946 in the Journal of Acoustical Society of America. And that's him there with the first type A supersonic reflectoscope, which is what he had called it. So next we'll talk about how this kind of all led to the use of ultrasound in a more clinical setting. And we get to this gentleman named Karl Theo Dussek. So he was an Austrian physician. He was a neurologist and psychiatrist by training. and he became essentially the first physician to ever apply ultrasound as a diagnostic technique in humans. He termed the phrase for this process hyperphenography, and being a neurologist and psychiatrist, his primary interest was how to identify the various structures in the brain. So he used something called the through transmission technique. So he had two transducers placed on either side of the patient's head. And what he was trying to do is produce ventriculograms, which were echo images of the different brain ventricles. And on the right, you see one of his images on the top, and then the proposed illustration of what we're seeing, which he thought the black shadowing represented the fluid-filled ventricles inside the brain. And that was the first kind of known use of ultrasound in the medical or clinical setting. Ultimately, however, in the 1950s, various other scientists demonstrated that Dussik's images were all artifact, because it was impossible to image intracranial structures using something like the through transmission technique, because there's so much absorption and reflection of ultrasound waves by skull bone. And we know that during like everyday echo scanning, whenever you're over rib space, there's way too much artifact. You can't make out really anything through it. So that was kind of just the first example of that. Next, we move on to the first use of ultrasound for cardiac diagnostic imaging. So that occurred in 1949 by a German physician named Wolf Dieter Keidel, and he scanned the heart using the same technique that Dussik used earlier, called transmitted ultrasound, and his objective was to identify the different cardiac chambers and the volumes. He actually tried the pulse reflection method, or the pulse echo method, which is where you just have one transducer and it sends the frequency through the object that you're interested in, and then the wave gets transmitted back into the same transducer, which also acts as the receiver. But he ultimately ended up rejecting the pulse echo technique and instead chose to pursue the transmission technique. And what they were trying to do is essentially look at the energy change of ultrasound as they transmit the waves through the thorax. So similar to how a chest X-ray, depending on different densities of the structures inside the thorax, will highlight certain areas over others, Keidel wanted to do the same thing with ultrasound to generate the first interpretable information about cardiac filling and physiology. And so his work was done using really low ultrasound frequencies, so around 57.5 kilohertz. Modern phased array probes used in cardiac imaging are around 4 to 7 megahertz, so that's 3 orders of magnitude higher. In 1950, he ended up publishing about the acoustic heart shadow and how it correlated to the heart volumes and function. And his work was titled "A Method to Register Volume Changes in the Human Heart." So the real kind of start of echocardiography, how we think about it today, began in 1953 with these two gentlemen, Edler and Hertz. Edler was a physician in Sweden, and Hertz was a physicist. He's actually the son of the famous Hertz, whom frequency units are named after. So they were working together in Lund in Sweden. In 1953, they were essentially the first two people to ever successfully use reflected ultrasound, or pulse echo ultrasound, to examine the heart. And this started because Edler initially wondered whether ultrasound could be used for cardiac diagnostic imaging, and he asked Hertz for advice. And Hertz only knew of its application for non-destructive testing of metals, which we talked about earlier, dating back to the 1940s. So they ended up finding a scanner in the Kokum shipyard in a nearby city in Sweden called Malmo, and they ended up testing the machine on themselves. They were so interested by the echoes and the signals they received that they ended up borrowing the machine for a weekend to do more testing. And after this, the two essentially became convinced that this ultrasonic reflectoscope made by Firestone in the 40s could become a valuable tool for diagnosis of various heart diseases. So they ended up loaning a machine from the German manufacturing company Siemens. Hertz ended up creating this attachment, which he attached to the cathode of the oscilloscope, and that was used to record the output of the signals that they were picking up from their heart. So they basically attached this oscilloscope and the cathode to a rolling paper, and they created the first ever film of a roll of an M-mode echocardiographic reading in October 29th of 1953. And that's the first ever M-mode strip there that they published in their initial work in the Royal Physiologic Society of London in 54. So in terms of Edler's primary clinical interest in the 1950s, he was working a lot with mitral stenosis, and that was his concentration. He wanted to see how ultrasound could be applied in this situation to record the different signals from the heart in normal patients versus those who had mitral stenosis. So initially, when he was doing his M-mode tracings, he described this echo signal that he thought was actually coming from the back wall of the left atrium. And to find out what the true identity of the signal was, he ended up doing ultrasounds on critically ill patients who were dying. He ended up marking the location and the direction of the ultrasound beam when he pointed the transducer to the signal. And after the patient died, he, in the same direction that the ultrasound probe was faced, kind of similar how we do like a pericardiocentesis, he ended up putting an ice pick into the chest in that same direction of the beam. And then in the autopsy, they discovered that what he transected was the anterior leaflet of the mitral valve, and in fact was not the back wall of the left atrium. And we can see his M-mode tracings there as he beamed over the anterior leaflet of the mitral valve, and particularly those who have mitral stenosis. So Edler ended up reporting various structures that they were able to identify on this during this process that they called an ultrasound cardiogram. He made a film shown in the European Congress of Cardiology in 1960, where he described the mitral valve with mitral stenosis and various other structures, including the other cardiac valves, the back wall, the left ventricle, and they also included a description of a patient who had a large anterior pericardial effusion. But despite all of the other findings that Edler reported, he thought the main practical application of echo was to detect mitral stenosis, and he essentially relied entirely on the M-mode diastolic E to F slope for both qualitative and quantitative diagnoses. And on the right, you can see an original publication from Edler in 1967 called Ultrasonic Cardiography, where he describes the essentially the waveform of the anterior leaflet of the mitral valve during M mode and in line with the ECG, which demonstrates the patient's resting heart rate. So after Helmut Hertz and Inge Edler's work in the 50s, this field of echocardiography started to draw a lot more interest. In the 50s, there were various scientists in Japan who were also starting to work with echocardiography. And one physicist named Shigeo Sadamura started using continuous wave Doppler method for inspection of cardiac functions for the first time in echocardiography. And he ended up publishing his work in the Journal of Acoustical Society of America in 1957. And in his paper, he states, when the continuous ultrasonic wave is sent forth towards the heart from the surface of the chest wall, the cardiac motion causes the Doppler effect upon the partial wave reflected from it. Therefore, an apparatus that's suitably constructed for sending and receiving ultrasounds is quite useful for the investigation of the movements of the atrium, ventricle, or valves through the analysis of the Doppler signals that are developed from the motion of the respective part. And on the right, we have a diagram from Sadamura's original work in the 50s, where the top is the heart sounds, B is the oscillogram that he used to record the continuous wave Doppler signals, and then C is the ECG readings. So this was the first use of Doppler in echocardiography in Japan. Next, we move on to the 1960s, where two scientists, one is John Reed, an American engineer, and the other is Claude Joyner, a cardiologist at the University of Pennsylvania. And the two collaborated in 1963 to build the first ever ultrasonic reflectoscope that was dedicated for cardiac diagnostic imaging. And they ended up publishing their work in Circulation in 1963. And these are original diagrams from their initial publication. So in figure 1, you see the block and the diagram of the ultrasound transmitter and the design that they used to create the machine. In figure 3, on the top, we have the ECG reading. On the bottom, we had M mode across the mitral valve in a patient who had AV block. And you can see the irregular heart rhythm there. And then in figure 4, there was a patient with mitral stenosis, and you see the shallow E to F slope, loss of the differentiation between the E and the A waves. And in the 1960s, we finally get to the point where they created an optical mirroring system that would originate the development of 2D echocardiography, or cross-sectional imaging of the heart. And that was done by Helmuth Hertz and Sven Olofsson, who initially created this rotating mirror system for cross-sectional imaging of the heart, which would ultimately lay the groundwork for 2D echo. Various other scientists across the world at this time were doing the same thing. And in the 60s, a group of investigators in Japan created a prototype mechanical sector scanner that could essentially create a static 2D silhouette of the heart at any time in the cardiac cycle. And then this work was further advanced in the 1960s by Arne Asperg, who ended up creating 2D cardiac images that allowed cardiac motion to be followed, giving us temporal resolution from echo in cross-sectional imaging, not just the M mode. And this was published originally by him in 1967 in the journal Ultrasonics, and his work was titled An Ultrasonic Cinematography of the Living Heart. And these were the first cross-sectional images that he created of the heart during one cardiac cycle. And on the right, you can see the different markers demonstrating the depth or the distance. And at the depth of 4 to 6 centimeters, he describes the intraventricular septum bouncing as you go through the various parts of the cardiac cycle. And lastly, I want to touch on this cardiologist named Harvey Feigenbaum, who's considered essentially the founder of echocardiography in the United States, and he published the first textbook on echocardiography in 1972. This textbook is now in its 8th edition, and in 1975, Dr. Feigenbaum would collaborate with several other American cardiologists, and they would create the American Society of Echocardiography. I just wanted to give a quick anecdote that Harvey Feigenbaum writes in one of his articles. In 1963, I was working in the cardiac cath lab. My investigational interest was in studying left ventricular diastolic function or compliance. I was initially using catheterization techniques to measure outputs, volumes, and pressures, but I was frustrated with the tediousness and inaccuracies inherent in these techniques. As is my common practice, I usually lunch in my office and read throwaway literature. In one of these throwaway journals, I noticed an advertisement by a company making ultrasound instruments. The ad claimed that there was an instrument that could measure instantaneous cardiac volumes with ultrasound. I called the company, and the person who answered the phone informed me that they were going to display the instrument at the upcoming American Heart Association meeting in Los Angeles that year, and so I arranged to see it there. When I went to the booth where the instrument was being displayed, it became apparent that the advertisement was totally false. The people at the booth had absolutely no idea how their instrument could possibly measure cardiac volume. Instead of turning away in disgust, I asked the person displaying the equipment to tell me a bit about the instrument. I proceeded to take the ultrasonic transducer and place it on my own chest, and I was able to find a signal that I found fascinating. This was likely the same echo that Hertz saw about 10 years earlier. The salesman had no idea what the signal represented. By assessing the way the signal was moving and checking my own pulse, I judged that the signal had to be coming from the back wall of the left ventricle. I asked the salesman how such a signal could be produced, and he told me that there must be an interface with different acoustic properties such as density. I asked what would happen if there were fluid in the area of the back wall of the left ventricle. He said that the fluid should be free of any echoes. I then asked the salesman if this instrument could be used to detect a pericardial effusion. I don't think he knew what pericardial effusion was. When I returned to Indiana, I learned that the neurologist had an ultrasound instrument used to detect the midline of the brain, I went to see the equipment and noticed that it was not being used. I borrowed it and proceeded to find the signal I had noted in Los Angeles, and the echo was indeed easily found. And with additional experience, I was convinced the signal was coming from the back wall of the left ventricle. I then found a patient with a pericardial effusion, and as predicted, there was now an echo-free space between a moving echo and a non-moving echo instead of the usual singular moving signal. We proceeded to go to the animal lab and confirm this observation. We succeeded, and therein lies the origin of my career in echocardiography. So that's the origin of echo up until the 1970s. And of course, since then, in the last 50 years, there's been countless other developments. In 1970, I believe they did the first stress echo on a normal heart. In 1974, this gentleman named Louis Teicholz published a method for calculating the ejection fraction of the left ventricle using the dimensions. In 78, Griffith and Henry developed a combined instrument that could do both imaging and Doppler. And in 92, Hewlett-Packard developed multiplane transesophageal echocardiography. In 92, they also developed color and pulse tissue Doppler. And in 2008, Lisa Sugang and colleagues developed real-time live 3D transesophageal imaging. And there's continued developments going on in the field today. So just a couple of slides on what echocardiography is recognized as and looked at as today. It's clearly widely recognized now as one of the top discoveries in cardiology of the 20th century. It's a critical tool that we use for non-invasive testing and assessing the heart structure and function in patients every single day. It also plays a critical role in therapeutics, including monitoring patients during cardiovascular surgeries, visualization to guide procedures like valve surgeries and interventions, and ultrasound guidance for bedside procedures like pericardiocentesis. And it's become a staple across multiple different specialties in medicine. A kind of local aspect that I wanted to share was a study published by Dr. Jack Tu and his colleagues at the ICES group. And they essentially looked at the temporal trends and how we use echo in Ontario in the early 2000s. And we can see that the total number of echoes that they did in 2002 was around 370,000. And only 7 years later, by 2009, that number had almost doubled to 630,000. They found essentially a 54% increase in the new and repeat echocardiograms that were being performed over the duration of that study. And I think that just serves to highlight the prevalence of echo in the modern medical society and how reliant we are on echocardiography now. And I imagine in the last 15 years, this number has continued to rise further and further. So again, these are the objectives that I had hoped to touch on today. And at this point, I'll take any questions, any comments that people in the audience have.
So I just want to thank Chai for doing what you do, because I think this is one of the best historical echo lecture that I've heard for a long time. Usually it's given by people who receive their Life Achievement Award, and then they would give a review of the history of echocardiography. So I want to congratulate you on the details. I think at some point we should write this up, because I think you taught me a lot about before Edler and Hertz, because all the piezoelectric effects and things like that. I mean, we briefly mention it usually, but we don't go back into detail. So I really want to congratulate you. I think there can be a little bit more depth of each of these things, like color Doppler is, et cetera, but it's really good. And as there's a saying that before you know where you're going, you have to know where you have been, and using the past can predict the future. And in many ways, I love history of medicine for that reason. And thank you. And I really like you a lot when I saw the title, because I always love hearing about history of medicine, and because it's really fascinating how so many people have the insights and intuition and so on and so forth to bring forth to the field that we do. It seems very intuitive now for us to get a MO, 2D, color Doppler, and 3D, and with a flick of a button. And but it has taken about 65 years to develop that, and even that in history of science is actually a very short time. So I want to congratulate you on your review of this topic. We should talk afterwards.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Dr. Chow.
Oh, any comments from my colleagues? And by the way, I actually have that book, like the one that you just showed by Dr. Feigenbaum. I actually have that book in my office. So if you want to see the real version signed by Dr. Feigenbaum, please come to my office.
Oh, that's awesome. Cool. I saw some available online, like the fourth or fifth editions for like $10, but I think the original copies are like several $100s now. They're very
It was,
expensive.
I think Howard and I were there at one of the ASE gala, and they were actually auctioning these books with the authors who signed them in the hope of raising funds for ASE Foundation for their charitable work. So I think it's really fantastic. So, and also have the other book by Liv Hedler. Dr. Hedler is the one who did a lot of work from Norway, and also spent a lot of time teaching in Saudi Arabia. And she did a lot of work on Doppler. And she is the one who came up with 220 overpressure half-time for calculating mitral valve area. So I have that book signed as well. Unfortunately, she passed away a few years ago. Okay, any other comments from anyone online?
Yeah, see if there's anything on the chat. I didn't see anything.
Anything in the chat?
Ming, it's Bob.
Hi, Bob.
Hi. Che, one of the things you didn't mention was the notion of A mode and B mode echo, which kind of came in and around the time of M mode echo. So, with your talk, it sort of sounds like M mode echo was kind of the beginning, but actually, I think A mode echo was first, right? And sort of M mode and B mode, I'm not sure if they came in together, but maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because we still, in the textbooks, the old textbooks had that in there, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. The initial use of echo was A mode, and I think Hertz and Edler were the first to demonstrate both A, M, and B mode, from what I read. But in terms of the clinical applications, which is what I was trying to focus on today, I think Edler's primary concern or focus was to use M mode in the setting of mitral stenosis, but both A and B, I think, were initiated first, but Edler and Hertz, I think, were the first to use all of those.
Right, but I guess what's interesting is in the history of St. Michael's, anyway, echo, Trevor Robinson, who was the first echographer at St. Mike's, who had been trained in the States, actually started with A mode, which stands for amplitude mode, and used actually an oscilloscope that, so you had oscilloscope. I'm not sure how they recorded it at the time, but that was done at St. Mike's back in the 70s when Trevor started at St. Michael's, and then the B mode really led to the ability to create an M mode image, which followed. So certainly back in the day when I was a resident trainee, Trevor was doing M modes at St. Mike's, but he was still doing the A mode because Trevor always liked to hold on to what the beginning. So he was doing both A mode and M mode imaging for St. Michael's back in the mid to late 70s.
So Bob, you've talked about this before, and I think I've heard from Trevor as well. Could you give us a short summary of the history of echo in Toronto? You talked about Trevor, obviously Harry Rakowski at the UHN. Do you want to share a little bit about your memories of echo establishing at U of T?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I'm not sure if there was anybody in Toronto before Trevor, because Harry came later, right? So Harry sort of started the Toronto General around 19 1979 or 80, having gone off to train with Rich Popp in Stanford. And he really learned on the first 2D echo machine, which was called a Varian. But Trevor was at St. Mike's well before that. And I don't know if there was anybody else in Toronto doing echo at that time. So I don't know that part of the history, Howard.
Right.
But Trevor was doing A mode and then M mode echo. Harry went away and came back in 79 or 80 with the first Varian. And actually, Trevor got a Varian at St. Mike's about a year after Harry got his at Toronto General. And he was the first decent 2D echo machine. And at that point, echo took off. Feigenbaum's textbook, that first image there with the M mode of the atrial myxoma, right? But the real driver for echo that made everybody believe that we needed to have it was a 2D echo image of an left atrial myxoma, right? Was really the first way you could diagnose a left atrial myxoma pre-morbid, right? Like there was, with angiography, it was hard to see a myxoma, and a lot of those patients died. So the diagnosis was made at post-mortem. So there wasn't really, and there was no CT scanning, or there was no other way to image and find a left atrial myxoma pre-mortem. So 2D echo was an easy way, if you like, to find it. And that actually, I think, is the one diagnosis that made it essential that all cardiac surgical centers anyway have an echo machine that would allow you to see that. But Trevor may have been the first one in Toronto. I don't actually know that, Howard.
Okay. No, thank you.
Mm-hmm. That explains why Dr. Robinson, when we were working with him, he always has a book of all his atrial myxoma cases. So then, like, he and I or us will be chatting about, what are you up to now? And it's like, by the time I talk to him, it's about 108 or something like that over the years. But just for colleagues online, Dr. Trevor Robinson is one of our colleagues. He passed away a number of years ago, but succeeding his legacy, Dr. Lisa Robinson is now our dean of our faculty of medicine, telemetry faculty of medicine. So very proud to have this lineage that goes back to our colleague. So Dr. Howard, just curious, when it goes back to Dr. Robinson's period, how many echo was he doing a day? He had only one machine, and I remember when I saw him, I still saw, like, when I first arrived, I saw the machine, I took a picture of it. There was like the photographic sensitive paper that would be like rolling and rolling. And how many would he do a day?
Well, not very many. He actually had one tech, and her name was Linda Robinson. Yep. No relation.
Yep.
And Linda, actually, I think is still involved in ultrasound. She works for one of the ultrasound companies.
Yep.
But Linda would actually, he trained her to do the studies. So I would suspect that they would do, 4 a day, something like that. Sort of one tech, one machine.
Yeah, very selectively.
Yeah, and the first M mode echoes were not they were not recorded by videotape. They were actually recorded on angiography film, and he would look at these, shine a light through the film on a piece of paper below the M mode when he was reading the M modes, and do the measurements with calipers and a pencil and a ruler sort of thing. It was in a closet, tiny little closet. There was only room for him in there.
I remember that. Yeah,
that's how the echoes
arrived. Yep.
They were on video film. Same thing. The same film we used to use for heart caths. The old film. Yeah.
Yeah, for younger colleagues in the room, one of the most difficult thing to do during your Royal College exam, because they will show you a film, actually is a film is a Kodak film. There's like a big roll. You have to make sure you actually mount it correctly, and then like you fumble, then it's like, oh my god, that goes that station. So I used to have to actually practice on mounting the film. They'll just hand you a roll of film. It's like, interpret this. Okay, great. So any other stories or questions? I mean, there's a lot about history. I mean, we barely touch on a whole bunch of things, including, the development of 3D and then development of, eyes, because eyes is actually a echo, so monoplane. There was came from Mayo, and then there's a whole bunch of other things that miniaturization of the echo, and how Jim Thomas actually bring the ATL machine to the space station, and it goes on and on. But the history of our field is actually extremely rich. Well, without further ado, and very proud that Chai actually took on this very interesting topic, and I think we should look at publishing it.